The idea about us being strange fruit when we're hanging from trees, like that's not just, it's not isolated. Like that metaphor actually means something. We are not seen as human beings. And
this is so upsetting, like when you really think about it. So for those of you who aren't familiar with strange fruit, it's literally talking about the lynching of mainly Black men.
Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees.
And their bodies being hung from trees, and that visual, that being strange fruit. And it almost enrages me that there is a comparison being made between masculine Black male leadership and the terrorizing of the Black community to destroy the Black man. Man, the irony of this is not lost on me, y'all. The irony of this is not lost on me. That I'm watching a Black man completely stripped of his masculinity, completely dressed as a woman and believing himself to be a woman, sit and talk about strange fruit. The lynching of Black male leaders who were masculine, who were building, who were protecting, and that manhood being snuffed out by mass murder of them to prove a point about where the Black man stood, which was in a weakened position and underneath the white man. So it is just crazy to me. It is crazy to me that a man who has completely shirked his manhood for womanhood is sitting there referencing strange fruit, which was the intentional diminishment of Black manhood by white supremacy, as an argument for accepting diminished manhood in him. How does that make sense? That makes no sense, and it's insulting. It's insulting to our ancestors who hung on those trees and were the strange fruit. They were not hanging there because they were feminine. Believe me, if they had all put on dresses, if they had all behaved feminine, if they weren't building communities, if they weren't leading households, if they weren't doing all those things, there would have been no reason to hang them from the trees. They hung them from the trees because they were exuding manhood and growth, and it angered white people. And so they hung them from the tree, and that visual is the strange fruit. The hanging of manhood, of Black manhood from a tree, is the visual of strange fruit.
I almost think that the left is creating its own decline. I think the left doesn't know how to be a tribe in the way the right does. The left is cannibalistic. It eats its own. You know, I mean, this isn't going to sound very kind, but
we're not here for kindness.
People on the left, you know, so there's something to be said, of course, for ideals, and I believe very much in that. But I think when one speaks about politics, sometimes there can be a kind of an extremist idea of purity. And it's so easy to fall afoul of the ridiculously high standards set there. And there's often also a kind of self-righteousness. I mean, you follow the rules, and if you don't, you're cut down very quickly.
Federal law allows citizens to reproduce, distribute, or exhibit portions of copyrighted motion pictures, videotapes, or video discs under certain circumstances without authorization of the copyright holder. This is called fair use and is allowed for purposes of criticism, news reporting, teaching, and parody, which doesn't infringe of copyright under 17 U.S.C. 107.
Because Beyoncé had that song,
feminist, a person who believes in the social, political, and economic equality of the sexes.
You wake up.
Staying with this issue of feminism, femininity, does it matter how you've arrived at being a woman? I mean, for example, if you're a trans woman who grew up identifying as a man, who grew up enjoying the privileges of being a man, does that take away from becoming a woman? Are you any less of a real woman?
So when people talk about, are trans women, my feeling is trans women are trans women. And I think if you've lived in the world as a man, with the privileges that the world accords to men, and then sort of switch gender, it's difficult for me to accept that then we can equate your experience with the experience of a woman who has lived from the beginning in the world as a woman and who has not been accorded those privileges that men are. I don't think it's a good thing to conflate everything into one. I don't think it's a good thing to talk about women's issues being exactly the same as the issues of trans women.
You need people like me. Good? You're not good. You just know how to hide, how to lie. Me, I don't have that problem. Me, I always tell the truth, even when I lie.
It is amazing that my very existence automatically makes myself and women like me the bad guy. You see, there is not a safe space for heterosexual women who believe in two genders and gender norms. There is not a safe space for women who love the idea of being wives and mothers and homemakers and find it fulfilling and not oppressive. There is not a safe space for women who are traditionally feminine and enjoy masculinity in men. There is not a safe space for heterosexuals who have compassion for individuals who have disordered thinking about gender or sexual relations, but don't feel that they should have to co-sign or enable that behavior or promote it in public spaces. There is not a safe space for women who carry traditional values and want to hold on to them. There is not a safe space for women who actually are happy to have wombs and excited when they have children inside of them and take pleasure in nursing those children from their breasts. There's not a safe space for us. No, we represent everything oppressive. We represent a retrograde sort of lifestyle and ideology. There's only room for radicals in this conversation. There's no room for those of us who are comfortable with social norms. If you're sensitive and if you don't want to hear politically incorrect conversation about these issues, then you should turn away now. Just leave my video. Because we don't tiptoe on eggshells here, and we don't pander to anyone's ideologies here. It's going to be honesty or nothing. And if you're not ready for that, if you're not ready to be disagreed with, then this is definitely not the place for you.
So say good night to the bad guy. Come on. The last time you're going to see a bad guy like this again, let me tell you.
So you guys, I have tried so hard to avoid touching this conversation, even though it's like right up my alley. For the past 2 weeks, I have had videos downloaded on my Mac, and I just fell back. You know, when I saw some of my favorite female YouTubers, if you can believe it. I listen to Black feminist YouTubers or liberal Black female YouTubers. I don't agree with everything that they say, but for me, I really don't have a problem listening to people I disagree with. I like to hear other people's thoughts. I don't expect conformity of mind for me to enjoy somebody's content. So when I heard I Am Eloho, her video on transgenders being women, I was triggered, but okay. And then when I heard For Harriet kind of go on a whole rant about traditional femininity and how all women aren't the same, and how, again, Black men who believe themselves to be women ought to be embraced by women as real women, or there could be no true progress for womankind.
Nasty comments under that video. Nasty comments about, well, we're cis women, we're biological women. Why should biological women have to care about trans women? You're being a mammy, you're being a mule. Biological women have rights too. It's like, bitch, get out of here.
And even equating not accepting them as women to white supremacy.
So I went to my Twitter page, and I don't know what the real tweets are, but I said, I'm really tired of transphobic Black women. Don't y'all understand that disrupting normative gender works in our best interest? Don't y'all understand that deconstructing the gender binary, the white supremacist gender binary, works in our favor? So the idea that somehow you are fundamentally or materially harmed by the kind of work that cisgender Black women should do to make sure that our spaces are welcome for all Black women is bullshit. That shit pisses me off. And that shit is rooted fundamentally in white supremacist ethics. And I said that. And I said, I don't know why y'all are spending your time being transphobic when it would help you enormously by rejecting those white supremacist ideals, by rejecting the white supremacist construction of gender, which has resulted in a binary that excludes women of different that excludes different gender presentations, non-normative gender.
I was doubly triggered and a little bit saddened by the fact that she said that people who didn't share her viewpoint were not welcome in her space.
Right? First of all, I don't even know how y'all even get to For Harriet. How y'all get to this space? Y'all know where I stand. Y'all know what it is. This is a space for all women. Cisgender, heterosexual, queer, trans, everybody. So I don't know how you get to the For Harriet YouTube, how you get to the For Harriet Instagram trying to say that transphobic shit.
Because I'm not sure if she was aware, but many of us enjoy her content who don't necessarily agree with everything that she says. But in fairness, it is a well-known fact that heavily liberal thinking people, far left thinking people, are hypocritical in that they want you to be accepting of everything, but they are not very tolerant or accepting of people who don't share their viewpoints. But I wasn't going to touch it because I didn't want it to come off as catty. You know, anytime a woman comments on another woman's content, it's viewed as catty. So I didn't want it to come off as catty if I touched on this issue of embracing transgenders into the Black female community, or whether or not it was equivalent to white racism not to do so. I just fell back. And then I saw the Black femininity channels who highly are on the divestment bandwagon get into the conversation and try to defend Black women's rights to have spaces for heterosexual, naturally born Black women. And even then, I said, I have no dogs in this race that I need to put out to the track. But when I saw for Harriet's video where she brought up 2 Black men who identify as women to discuss the importance of them being integrated into Black female spaces, and heard one of these Black men who is very passable physically say that Blackness was queerness, Blackness was transgenderism, Blackness was all of these things.
I would even take it further to say that Blackness in and of itself is queer, is trans, is other, is undefined, right?
Okay, shake the table, come on.
I could not resist talking about it. I mean, that pushed me over the edge. So here we are. Let's be clear. My video is not an indictment on any of the people I discuss here. And I will be speaking to their talking points and not them as individuals, because ad hominem attacks have no value to real meaningful discourse. But if somebody disagreeing with you is enough for you to feel violated and attacked, and as if violence is being enacted against you, you should not watch my video. Because I will be disagreeing, and I won't be mincing words. I'm not here to be politically correct or to walk on eggshells for people or to pretend like one person's delusion is my reality. I'm just here to present my thought process. And you will find that I'm far more tolerant and acquiescent to people who share different views than mine than, well, many of the people on the other side of the tracks are to do for individuals like me. At the end of the day, there will be very few people with my viewpoints who will probably make videos about these topics because we're always afraid to be viewed as hateful and offensive. But if it's only okay for one side to voice their opinion and nothing they can say can be hateful or offensive, then there's not an actual discourse. And it gives the illusion that overwhelmingly people agree with their rhetoric. And I'm here to tell you that's simply not the case. So let's get into it.
I almost think that the left is creating its own decline. I think the left doesn't know how to be a tribe in the way the right does. The left is cannibalistic. It eats its own. You know, I mean, this isn't going to sound very kind, but
We're not here for kindness.
people on the left, you know, so there's something to be said, of course, for ideals, and I believe very much in that. But I think when one speaks about politics, sometimes there can be a kind of an extremist idea of purity. And it's so easy to fall afoul of the ridiculously high standards set there. And there's often also a kind of self-righteousness. I mean, you follow the rules, and if you don't, you're cut down very quickly.
Hey y'all, how are you doing? I'm great. Thank you so much for asking. It's me, Kim, and I'm back for another video. This is a conversation with Kat Black, a spectacular YouTuber, and Lorraine Aylith. She's an organizer and just a stunningly brilliant mind. Just genius. They're 2 Black trans women, and we had a long overdue conversation about the relationship between cis Black women and trans Black women. We talked about how white supremacy influences so many of our ideals about what gender is, what it means, and how it should be expressed. And we talked about femininity because they are 2 very traditionally feminine presenting women. So why do all of that if all of this is fake? This was a wonderful conversation and I learned so much, and I'm just going to reiterate. This is a space for all Black women. Cis, trans, straight, queer, abled, disabled, all of it. You cannot be pro-Black or pro-Black woman and then try to keep people out. Nope, you are just recreating the ideals of the oppressor, right?
I thought that this was really interesting because if Black men only have to dress like and say that they're women to be forcibly embraced by Black women, then how is it a space for Black women?
Let's go ahead and jump into it. Right now, I've been getting into these back and forths with cis women who are asking, why should we have to include trans women in our spaces? So what is your response to why is it important for Black women's spaces to be inclusive of women, trans women, and cis women?
Well, I guess for me, I can say that it's been a fairly alienating experience for me to go through the world personally being seen and treated as a Black woman, but having no, feeling like I have no centralized community of other Black women to talk to without feeling like I have to defend myself as a trans woman. You know, like Black women get it, you know, and I feel like I often have to fight and defend myself within mostly Black spaces because of the way that I get rejected, I guess. I made a whole video about this on my channel recently. It's that weird, like, all right, I'm going to go through the world being treated as a Black woman, but then feel like I can't have certain conversations about being a Black woman with other Black women. Right. That's been my own personal experience.
I think this is a really interesting point. So what Kat is essentially saying, and I believe him when he says this, is that as a trans person, so as a man that believes himself to be a woman and dresses as a woman, that he finds as he moves through the world, and people respond to him as a Black woman, that when it comes time to engage in Black female spaces, Black women are not embracing him as a Black female. I would liken it to this. Try to follow me here. I get a really good police officer's uniform, and I go through the world in my car that transformed into looking like a actual police officer's car, and I wear my uniform and I stop people on the road, I give them tickets, I help old ladies across the street, I solve crimes, I do all of this police officer work. And the community, they don't know because I am dressing like a police officer, I'm talking like a police officer, I'm acting like a police officer, my car looks like a police officer's vehicle. So the community at large responds to me like I am a police officer. But then one day I decide that I want to go to the police precinct and I want a desk there. I want to be in on the police scuttlebutt. I want a police officer's paycheck. But when I get to the police station, they reject me because I'm not actually a cop. And although I go through the world as a cop and I've gone to great pains to present myself as a cop and I do all of the actions of a cop, the actual police are like, dude, you're not a cop. In fact, we reject the fact that you're out here pretending to be a cop. It's not right. We're actual police officers and you're not. And then I go home and I sulk because that's not fair. I live my life as a police officer. I do everything police officers are supposed to do, and most people can't tell me from a real police officer. So how dare the actual cops in the city not embrace me? It's literally the same logic, which I find fascinating. But I do understand that this is a mental illness, and it's interesting to hear these young Black men talk about their experiences within their dysphoria.
For me, I really don't care how people feel about trans women. I mean, I do care, right? But it's really less about that and more about if you really are trying to be liberated, then there needs to be some type of nuance in your understandings around gender and Blackness, period.
That's an interesting argument. So this young man, who actually to me is far more passable than the other, although they're both very passable, his attitude is, in order for us to be liberated, we essentially need to embrace transgenders. I'm curious how embracing transgenders is intrinsically tied to our liberation. So let's see where this goes.
For me, I think a lot of people are using this idea of like intersectionality, right? Which I hate. People really use it so wrong all the time. But they use it and they say like, oh, well, Black women experience all these different forms of violence, and trans people are coming in and taking over and aren't taking into account the ways that we experience that violence. First off, we all experience various forms of violence, right? We all also can enact various forms of violence. And the existence of a Black person, the violence that they experience under white supremacy does not invalidate the violence that someone else experiences under white supremacy. And I would even take it further to say that Blackness in and of itself is queer, is trans, is other, is undefined, right?
Okay, shake the table. Come on.
Wow. Okay, so that was a lot. And this is actually the point where I realized I had to make this video. So intersectionality requires diversity, right? Because there's an overlapping, and overlap cannot happen without there being understood diversity and things to overlap, right? So he didn't really go into, or Lorraine did not really go into what he meant about the misuse of intersectionality, but this idea that Black is queer, is trans, is undefined is absolutely, totally false. Black is not queer. Black is not trans. Black is not undefined at all. But I really want him to kind of expound on this, because this is a pet peeve of mine. This desire to attach Blackness and make everything like it's Black is very problematic.
And so like the violence that we all experience as Black people may be nuanced, but it's deeply interconnected and connected to this idea that we don't have personhood. And I think that if we develop a more broad understanding of what that means to us, right? That you actually, your body is a site of like moral confusion. If we have that understanding and that analysis, then we'd be able to understand that it is the full gamut of Blackness and all experiences of Black people, and how we are impacted by systems and structures of white supremacy are very important for us to be able to develop comprehensive solutions to address what Black liberation looks like.
So I actually do agree with Lorraine here. He is correct that everything is amplified because of Blackness. So if you are a man, the trials and struggles that come with manhood are amplified because you are Black. If you are a woman, the trials and struggles and challenges that come with womanhood are amplified because you are Black. And for sure, in the same way, because most transgender people are white males, and Black transgenders are a minority within a minority, that all of the energy that transgender people get is amplified because they are Black. So I definitely agree with that. I don't think the next logical leap is that because all Black people experience an amplified sense of the struggles of their selected group, I don't think that the next logical leap, however, is that because Blackness amplifies struggles within individual groups, that all groups should be accepted. So again, this is like very dangerous rhetoric. So first of all, are Black bodies of moral confusion? Well, for white people, they certainly are, right? For white people, Black bodies are a source of moral confusion for them because their morals get convoluted when it comes to Black people. However, I just want to reiterate that wanting to protect the Blackness of people, wanting to protect individuals because they are Black, because of their Blackness, is not synonymous with wanting to co-sign lifestyle choices or mental illnesses, okay? Those things are not the same. They're not the same. So for example, I can stand by the fact, and I would say that's not even for Black trans people, but for all trans people, they should not be harmed. Nobody should be attacking and hurting them. But I can say that without then saying transgenderism is okay. Right? I don't have to agree with transgenderism to say that it is a violation to touch them. And their Blackness and their transgenderism are not synonymous. Okay? They're just not synonymous at all. In fact, in the case of transgenderism, the bigger issue is the transgenderism and not the Blackness. So if I had to make an argument, I wouldn't be like, well, don't hit that transgender because they're Black. I would say just don't attack transgenders, period. Keep your hands off of them. I understand they're mentally ill. It can be unnerving to deal with them, especially those who are not like these young men who don't pass as well, right? Because we tend to be more comfortable with the ones that present like Kat and Lorraine. We tend to be more comfortable with transgenders who are not clockable, who we can't really tell are transgenders, right? But the ones that look more masculine, which is the majority of them, we tend to be more uncomfortable with them. I don't have to prioritize, right, the fact that this trans person is Black and they need some sort of special protection because they're Black, because I would say that for any transgender person, right? I also don't think that because a Black person engages in a behavior, that the behavior must be co-signed. So even if I were to make the argument that, yes, I will protect you because you are Black, my protection doesn't mean that what you did is okay, right? My protection doesn't mean that I approve of your lifestyle. My protection doesn't mean that I'm co-signing your behavior. My protection is, okay, the outside community cannot harm you, cannot correct you, but we will still correct you and you might get harmed. Not speaking to just transgenders, but just speaking like in general. Do you know what I mean? There's a lot of behaviors we might choose to correct and discipline within the community, but we won't let any other people come in and do that to our people. But that's not co-signing your behavior or your lifestyle. The two things don't mingle that way, the way that he's trying to present them. But like I said, it's a clever strategy. If you feel my Blackness is worth protecting, then you must then co-sign my lifestyle because I'm a Black person living that lifestyle. It's like, no, it doesn't work that way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Laura, you said something that I've been trying to articulate. I don't know, people are not getting it. Maybe I'm saying it wrong. Maybe they're being willfully ignorant. Maybe they're willfully misinterpreting it. But when we are talking about white supremacy, one of the reasons why I have no problem at all making sure that my feminism, that my spaces are as inclusive as possible is because, like you said, our bodies have been always marked as outside of the norm, as less than, right? So me choosing to intentionally exclude trans women because they don't meet whatever definitions of womanhood is directly connected to white supremacy. Could you talk a little bit more about that formulation of Blackness is queer, Blackness is trans?
Yeah. Well, first, there's two things I think about when we talk about this. The first one, I think a lot of people talk about, when they talk about slavery and they talk about the violence and terror that Black people experienced, they use contemporary understandings of gender, contemporary understandings of like how we interact with one another, and they apply that in a historical context. It doesn't make sense. The ways that our folks, I don't even think our folks were thinking of gender the same way that we think about gender, because...
Okay, this is a really slippery slope. It's a little bit odd to me, the direction that Lorraine is about to take this, because he's going to make it as if the ideas we have of gender now are ideas that have never existed, and then try to double back on it and say that the ideas we have of gender now aren't new. Okay, so let's be clear on one thing. Throughout the earth, there's a very common view of gender roles. And they are normally separate, and they're pretty consistent across cultures and even in the Black community. And even if we look at slavery, the plight of a female slave and a male slave was very gendered, extremely gendered. Something that I really want to discuss in a little more depth is a lot of Black women have animosity toward their wombs and their bodies and childbearing because of the fact that our female ancestors were heavily judged by their gender. They were literally the creators of the new generation of slaves, and most of their lives were dedicated to being impregnated to propagate new bodies. That is wholly looking at the female body for being female and for carrying gender. So these gender divisions were even greater when we look at it in a historical context, both within the Western world where slavery was prevalent and without the Western world, even in African societies, but we'll get into that later.
Because yes, gender as a thing is a social construct. It's very different in different cultures and very different in different areas, right? The Western understanding of gender, Black people were not a part of society.
Okay, that's very disingenuous. Gender is pretty uniform in its presentation throughout different cultures. And this is what I will say. So I actually researched this because I wanted to look into just how different really is gender viewed throughout the world. And do you know that there are only 36 known cultures throughout the planet where there was something that maybe kind of resembled gender bending. And a lot of those things weren't actually gender bending. Like you would have cases, like there's one case in Africa of a tribe called the Ankole, and the Ankole people would pick one singular woman out of all of their tribe, and they would dress her up in what would traditionally be men's clothing so that she could communicate with a god. And then you'll have transgender people being like, look, see, that's an example of transgenderism in Africa. It's like, no, that was one woman. It had nothing to do with her lifestyle, nothing to do with her thinking she was a man. She was literally just a medium between the tribe and their god. And they just dressed her up in garb appropriate for her to be that medium. It had nothing to do with transgenderism. So most of Africa, and let's just say this, there are only 6 known civilizations in Africa that had anything similar to the Ankole people that can be twisted if you're trying to really shoot far and say that transgenderism or gender non-conforming norms were present in their societies. But the Ankole are an excellent example of how that's being overblown. The Ankole people had specific gender roles for men and women that were traditional as we see them, where women had roles that were suited to their bodies, their strength, the fact that they carried children, all of that, and that men had roles that were suited to what they would do. But it's not like they were just filled with trans people. Like that is very, very, very much a distortion of reality. And this trend is something we see throughout the earth. Like I said, there are literally millions of different groups of people throughout the earth, 36 cases, 36 historically provable cases of situations like the Ankole people. 36 cases like the Ankole people where there was some sort of behavior that people who really, really want to reach, really, really want to reach out and just try really hard to find something can kind of suck up behavior like this. Strangely, for all this talk of white supremacy, the most prevalent and blatant cases of transgenderism and gender nonconformity were in Europe. But we'll get to that in a minute. We'll get to how their ideology, strangely, while they're saying gender norms are conforming to Western ideals and white supremacy, but the most blatant cases of gender bending and transgenderism and exchanging of positionality in lifestyles were actually found in Europe. They're actually European in nature, which is what makes this even more incredibly ridiculous.
I will say, okay, we were freed, right? And then we were not actually seen as human beings. I think Reconstruction is very important to me because it was a period where they said, whoa, we have all these freed slaves who we had pontificated around what gender is. We pontificated around who gets to vote. We pontificated around like all of these things, right? And now we have these freed slaves who were not seen as human beings before.
Yeah, it's just really interesting. This constant reinforcement that the gender norms did not exist for Black people until Europeans made them exist, when most of Africa functioned in a state of gender normality. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, just think about that. Most of Africa did. Most of the world had very defined gender norms. And the women overarchingly, like it or not, were in more submissive and protected positions. And the men typically ran society. Even when we pull out things like Egypt, and some people like to say, well, Egyptian men and women were very equal. Well, the reality is the reason that Hatshepsut was so significant is that she was the first female pharaoh. And Egypt had existed for thousands of years. So, and keep in mind that it was very rare for there to be a female pharaoh even. So when we talk about gender roles not existing, that's simply not the case. Probably the biggest variation in African societies is that women had a great deal of equality and were not oppressed, but the gender roles themselves were present, right? Europeans propagated gender roles where women were oppressed in their role as women, whereas in Africa, gender roles definitely existed, but the women were not oppressed. So this idea that, you know, the way we view gender and the way men and women move in the world, you know, is totally dictated by white people is a lie. Most human societies conform to this because it made sense. It made sense. You wouldn't have a woman out there with a human being in her body engaging in certain behaviors and doing certain things. Some things just naturally were more pragmatic to be done by men than women. There wasn't always formula. So if a woman gave birth to a child, that child had to be nursed from the breast. If you have a human being completely dependent on you feeding them every couple of hours, there's a host of things you won't be doing. And it's not oppressive. And it wasn't created by white people. Nature made it that way. However, part of this dysphoria is denying nature, right? Part of the mental illness these people have is that they have blinders on to what is natural, and they try to demonize natural order. So I really want to just give pushback on this idea that, you know, white people didn't consider Black people when they created gender roles. And so why are we adhering to them? It's like not full. Gender roles existed outside of Western civilization. Gender roles existed prior to colonization. This is not something white people created. If anything, white people created this idea of conflating the genders. Greco-Roman society was huge on conflating genders. In fact, in Greco-Roman society, the men often replaced the women in their positions in society as sexual partners, in presentation, both male children and male adults. The first sexual encounters of most men were with other men. So really, this idea of men masquerading and dressing up as women and living their lives as women is extremely European in nature. It's not African in nature at all, strangely.
That we have to account for. And so when we assume these ideas of what gender is and these norms were constructed without you in mind. These norms were constructed without the concept of Blackness being a part of the conversation. And so it's very important, right, that we understand that we see that gender is a construct that is inherently anti-Black and works through white supremacy, right?
Gender is a concept that is anti-Black. Gender is a concept that is anti-Black. That's really the argument, is that if you believe in gender and it being fixed, like men are men, women are women, that is anti-Black. And, you know, when Lorray was talking, as he was talking, you know, because I'm breaking it up, but as Lorray is talking, he's moving real quick with his words. But if you don't stop and listen to what's coming out of his mouth, it's almost convincing until you actually sit there and dissect what is being said, which is ridiculous in its nature and indicative of the dysphoria in his mind.
To exclude Black people. The second thing I talk about, and I touched on it earlier, is personhood, right? A lot of us say like, oh, we're all human beings, like we all should be equal. That is an easily, a conversation you can easily subvert, because human is a biological idea, right? And it's about having human DNA. And I could also argue that Black people were not even afforded humanity for a very long time. Like when we look at triangular trade and stuff, we were seen as just raw goods, period. The idea about us being strange fruit when we're hanging from trees, like that's not just, it's not isolated. Like that metaphor actually means something. We are not seen as human beings. And
this is so upsetting, like when you really think about it. So for those of you who aren't familiar with strange fruit, it's literally talking about the lynching of mainly Black men.
Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees.
And their bodies being hung from trees, and that visual, that being strange fruit. And it almost enrages me that there is a comparison being made between masculine Black male leadership and the terrorizing of the Black community to destroy the Black man. Man, the irony of this is not lost on me, y'all. The irony of this is not lost on me. That I'm watching a Black man completely stripped of his masculinity, completely dressed as a woman and believing himself to be a woman, sit and talk about strange fruit. The lynching of Black male leaders who were masculine, who were building, who were protecting, and that manhood being snuffed out by mass murder of them to prove a point about where the Black man stood, which was in a weakened position and underneath the white man. So it is just crazy to me. It is crazy to me that a man who has completely shirked his manhood for womanhood is sitting there referencing strange fruit, which was the intentional diminishment of Black manhood by white supremacy, as an argument for accepting diminished manhood in him. How does that make sense? That makes no sense, and it's insulting. It's insulting to our ancestors who hung on those trees and were the strange fruit. They were not hanging there because they were feminine. Believe me, if they had all put on dresses, if they had all behaved feminine, if they weren't building communities, if they weren't leading households, if they weren't doing all those things, there would have been no reason to hang them from the trees. They hung them from the trees because they were exuding manhood and growth, and it angered white people. And so they hung them from the tree, and that visual is the strange fruit. The hanging of manhood, of Black manhood from a tree, is the visual of strange fruit. And yet the destruction of Black manhood through mental illness that causes Black men to want to be Black women is somehow being justified through another attempt to destroy Black manhood through lynching? This is why I could not resist touching on this, because that is crazy. What kind of leap in logic is that? Just makes little to no sense. It makes little to no sense. I don't understand it.
For a long time, anthropologists, and that's why anthropology is even anti-Black, anthropologists argued that Black people were more animal than they were human. And then when they said, okay, we are human, maybe they're stemming from a different type of person. We have these are the white people and these are Black people, different lineages. And so that's the science, right? But anyway.
Look, all of that is true. But the thing is, and this is what I don't like about deceptive conversation. Yes, historically, Black people were viewed as part human. We know the Australians, part of the justification for killing off all of the Tasmanians and part of the justification for the way they treated Black people was Darwinism, was this idea that we were not human beings. Luray is on point with that. He tells no lies there. But to make the leap from Black people weren't considered human, so it is white supremacy for you to not accept that me as a Black man is really a Black woman and should be allowed in Black female spaces and be embraced by Black women as just like them. That's a huge, like, how do you get there? How do you get there? Like, I'm really curious. How do you get from, since Black people weren't considered humans, the natural leap is that if you don't consider me a Black man a woman, that you're kind of doubling down on Black people not being humans. There's no connection there. You can't just state a historical fact and then go, okay, well, because Black people weren't considered humans, whatever I do should be accepted. No, that's not how that works. That's not how that works at all.
Humanity is one thing, biological. Personhood is philosophical, right? And this idea that in order to be a person, you have to be a being who is a part of like the moral community and deserves moral consideration, right? And this is why, like, even when we talk about abortion or we talk about women's rights, etc., this has been a long issue, is because who gets personhood?
Okay, so I actually agree with Luray that personhood is essential to correct treatment. Right? So I literally just had an abortion debate over on Cynthia's channel where, one of my main points was that we dehumanize unborn children because then it makes it okay to harm them, right? So you take their humanity away, so then it's okay to harm them. We know the same thing was done with Black people. I just said it, Luray just said it, that Black people were viewed not as whole persons, therefore it made it okay to enslave and harm them. But you don't get to then say that if you deny my lifestyle, you are stripping me of my personhood, which is really what Luray is trying to say, right? We do it to babies. We did it to Black people. We don't want to do it to trans people. Here's the thing. The thing is, I still view trans people as human beings. That doesn't mean that I have to co-sign your lifestyle. I don't have to co-sign a man putting on a dress and a wig and makeup and getting breast implants. I don't have to co-sign that. I don't have to say that that is okay. I don't have to, as a woman, agree that you're a woman too because you've put on the costume. I don't have to do that to validate your personhood. That's not necessary. I don't think violence should be done against people, especially not mentally ill people. We can't be violent against people who are legitimately mentally ill. But that doesn't mean that the only way your humanity is recognized is for me then to play the mentally ill game with you. Like, okay, if you won't co-sign the fact that I think I'm a woman, you're denying my personhood. No, that's not how that works. You're still a human. You're still a person. You're just not a woman. It's not that hard to understand.
Right. And so we talk about Reconstruction. I love Reconstruction. I feel like everyone should study Reconstruction, right? When slaves are freed, there was no law about their personhood. And so they're just here, right? And so states were able to enact all of these laws to manage affairs in their areas, and they criminalized Blackness. So if a Black person is standing around, if a Black person just exists, I'm going to send you to jail for 9 years, and you're going to be in jail. And Angela Davis talks about the convict lease system, a new form of slavery, and actually even worse, because as a slave, you were actually property. So my money was tied up into keeping you alive. Here, the taxpayers are paying for it. So actually, I really don't care. You could die. Academics talk about fungibility, where
and there's insurance policies. Like that's the other thing about enslavement, right? They slaves are property, so they were insured. So if something happens, like you can get your money on that. Convict leasing is you don't get nothing. You
get nothing, yeah. And you're not even afforded. So it's and we're fungible, so we're easily replaced, right?
Yes.
So if this person dies, I'm gonna get somebody else, and it's this whole system, this thing. And so when we talk about ideas of like when we try to talk about what it means for someone to have personhood and what it means for you to fight for your rights as a woman or a man in this society, we have to really look at that history, right?
Okay, so all of that is true, but what does that have to do with Black women accepting a man who is in a dress, a man with a wig, a man who believes he's a woman? How does stating a historical fact about how Black people were treated suddenly segue into, okay, so since all this happened to our people, I've decided I'm a woman and you must accept that? And it's infuriating because you can nod your head because everything Lorraine is saying about history and Black people is true, but it does not connect to then me saying, okay, well, since all that happened to our people, boy, put on that dress. You get to be a girl.
And understand that white supremacy is super pervasive. And all of these systems operate in a way, one, they started without you in mind. And then when you come into the equation, they were then switched and changed to subvert you, right? And to make you feel less than. And so when we talk about like the bodies of trans people, right? The Black body, like I said, is the site of moral confusion. I think the issue with us is that trans bodies are a site of moral protest.
But trans people aren't overwhelmingly Black people. So I see where he's going with this. So Lorraine is saying, I have now shown you how historically Black people's bodies were the sites of moral confusion. Okay. So now trans bodies are the sites of moral confusion. Ergo, Black people should relate to us and then protect my right to be a man, as Lorraine is a man, in a dress with a wig and breast implants.
Us being able to take back our power and to say, I refuse to allow systems and structures to tell me how I can navigate space and take up space in this world. I refuse that. And that makes people scared and upset and see us as terrorists.
Right, but being trans has nothing to do with being Black. Most trans people are white men. Like literally, almost all trans people are white men. So it's not a moral protest of Blackness to be trans. If anything, it's assimilating yourself into white male culture to be trans. And I'll just digress to my former point, which is that in Greco-Roman society, this behavior was prevalent and common. Men acting and moving like women and engaging with each other as women, men totally abandoning their masculinity, is a very European concept. It's literally like their culture. So this distortion is like very confusing for me.
Yeah.
Whoa, Lorette. Oh, this is my shit. This is my shit. I so appreciated that. I thought it was, I thought that was a perfect explanation of what I've been trying to say. Much better than I could have. Kat, did you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I feel like she said everything that needed to be said.
Yeah. So I've always, it's so bizarre to me when I'm in these conversations, because I'm like, how are you going to fight the denigration of Black womanhood by trying to use the rules that white supremacy has laid out? Like, those rules are not for you. I think that was so perfect.
But white supremacy didn't define what womanhood is. Every human culture had a place for women that was appropriate. White supremacy didn't decide that men didn't get to wear dresses and call themselves women. In fact, white men love this idea. That's why they're mostly the trans people. White culture loves this idea. White culture loves testing normal societal boundaries. That's why Europe has the highest child sexual abuse rate. The continent of Eurasia is rife with men who want to put on dresses. It's their whole culture. So white supremacy actually doesn't conform to gender norms. They're highly oppressive towards women, biological, actual women with vaginas, and not inverted penises, but actual vaginas, actual wombs, actual breasts with functioning milk ducts. White supremacy has always been demeaning of that, and has promoted men taking the place of women. That is what they did in Greece and Rome. Everybody knows this. So why are the three of them sitting there, 2 men and 1 Black woman, which I did a video called, and maybe I'll link a card, Are Black Women the Weakest Link? Are we the weakest link in this? This attempt to subvert the Black community and indoctrinate them into Greco-Roman behaviors? Are we the weak link? Because I'm starting to feel like we are.
It's also kind of strange. I feel like this might be shaking the table a little bit. But Black women...
Take it.
Okay. Black women have these conversations about what we need Black men to do for us, right? About how Black men's ideas of liberation are so narrow that they are only concerned about themselves, but we are all a part of this community and we're all working for the betterment of this community. And in fact, sometimes, well, most of the time, Black women are doing the heavy lifting of organizing work, of on-the-ground work, of being selfless, of caretaking. But why you understand that conversation about the importance of community and caring for each other when you want to berate a Black man, but why as a cisgender Black woman do you not understand that we're talking about the same thing? Black trans women are in our communities. They're organizing, they're fighting, they're caretaking. Why would we want to do the exact same thing that we are so upset with Black men for doing?
Mm-hmm. The leaps in just logic are crazy to me, because as for Harriet, these words are leaving her mouth, this coming down hard on Black men and where Black men are failing, and us being able to see that as Black women. As these words are leaving her mouth, she's talking to 2 Black men. I promise you, I feel like there's a whole sector of Black women who will only like Black men who present like this. Like, I can't really vibe with 99.9% of Black women. But if you put on a dress and some makeup and a wig and call yourself a woman, all of a sudden, I love you, Black man. I love you, Black man. The irony, this is crazy. I was like, literally, this just hit me. Harriet said, Black men are all about protecting themselves. And even that Black women do the heavy lifting of protecting Black men. This is so interesting to me because these two men that she's talking to are Black men. Black men who are only interested in protecting themselves as trans people and who are trying to enlist the help of Black women to do the heavy lifting of protecting them. Y'all, I just blew my own mind. Let me repeat that. For Harriet, or Kim, her name is Kim, she just said that there's essentially this epidemic of Black men being self-focused on Black men, and that Black women aid in this by doing the heavy lifting for protecting of Black men. As a defense or an indictment of Black women who look at Black men who have decided to dress like women and act like women and say, okay, we're not caping for these Black men. So let me get this straight. It's not okay, and it is a problem for Black men to be self-centered on Black men when they are heterosexual, and it is enabling for Black women to support those Black men in those endeavors. That is bad. But if the Black man gets breast implants, puts on a dress and some makeup, and insists that he is a woman, we are then free to co-sign fixation on protection of their Black manhood in a dress. And it is not enabling for us to do the heavy lifting to protect that group of Black men. So heterosexual Black men who think they're men, bad. Black men who wear dresses, get breast implants, and think they're women, good. Okay, all right, I get you. I hear you, girl. I hear you. It doesn't make sense, but I hear you.
Yeah, I made the comment in one of my videos. I uploaded a video about why I haven't been talking a lot about the protests and things. And it's honestly because I'm tired, and I feel like all the things I wanted to say I've already said. But one of the statements I made in the video was that I feel like if I were killed tomorrow by the cops, I'm not very confident that people would march for me.
Right.
I'm not. And I see that every single time a trans woman gets killed. I go to, these spaces on the internet that are seen as, the Black media ports. And I read all the comments, and all the comments are arguing that this Black trans woman deserved to die because of who she is. There's all of these assumptions about, she tricked him, she did this, she did that. And then there's just this complete erasure of just how this is an extension of the violence that happens against Black women as a whole, Yeah.
So I just want to say that a Black man who believes himself to be a woman who is harmed is not an extension of violence against Black women. It's an extension of violence against Black men, because they are in fact men, right? Also, I do agree with Kat that the outrage for trans people is not as great. And I just have to keep it real. This is probably because most people view transgenderism as debaucherous. So in the same way, if a Black pedophile got killed, or a Black murderer got killed, or any kind of Black person engaging in debaucherous behavior, people aren't going to be freaking out and super angry if that person gets killed, because they're going to say, okay, their behavior was debaucherous. And harm often comes with debaucherous behavior. Now, this said, obviously, surely existing as a transgender person is no reason to harm somebody, but I'm just saying the outrage will be less. Kat is right. The outrage is less. Whether, Kat or other transgender people think it's fair or not, it's because you are looked at as individuals that are engaging in debaucherous behavior. And I think there's validity to that, right? So I think, if a man, goes and gets breast implants and puts on a dress and a wig, if he goes to a surgeon, and these surgeons ought to be criminalized, in his mentally ill state, and says, please, chop my penis up and, flip it inside out. I really, really want to be a woman. People are going to look at that like something is wrong with you. That's going to be a natural reaction and a correct reaction. Same thing, for females who want to be men. If you go and rip off half of your arm or a huge portion of the meat and flesh on your thigh because you want somebody to sew your vagina shut and fashion some sort of penis-like aperture on your body, people are going to look at that and think something is wrong with you. And it's because it is problematic. It is disturbing. It is wrong. It's something that should be treated, not enabled. But that doesn't justify violence against them. These people are mentally ill. They're mentally ill. And if you encounter somebody in the midst of their delusion, I would say the best thing would be to have corrective compassion. Now, I understand if a man, and because being unclockable is so valuable to them, being unclockable, meaning you can't tell if they're men or women, is so valuable to them, I can definitely understand. And I've known one man years ago, maybe almost 2 decades ago, I knew a man who ended up in a situation where a transgender person did not expose the fact that he was a man. And upon finding that out when they got intimate, he did flip out. Well, that's natural, because despite whatever delusion or dysphoria you're engaged in, because you believe yourself to be a woman, you're not a woman. And most men, most heterosexual men, are going to have a visceral reaction to being tricked. It's like, and I used the cop example earlier, if, I am in distress and there is a robbery at my house and I need somebody arrested, and instead of the real police, I get somebody who very deeply believes that they're a police officer and is wearing the uniform and is engaging in all the behavior but has no power to protect me as a police officer does, I'm going to be upset at that. But how more insulting is that to have happen to somebody when they are in an intimate situation with somebody? If they find out you actually have a penis, even though you have breast implants and you're wearing a wig or makeup or wearing your hair long. If they find out that after they have sex with you, that they've actually put their penis inside of your penis. Because when they have the inversion therapy to create those fake vagina-like structures, it's actually just them flipping the man's penis inside out and kind of shoving it in his body. Well, a man could go crazy and kill you if he finds out that he just stuck his penis inside of your penis. So that is when a person is so mentally ill that your mental illness can literally put you in danger, right? Your delusion doesn't extend to other people. So in some situations, it could be the transgender's fault in situations like that. Just like there are some situations where a woman can be harmed and she could play a part in bringing that harm on, right? But in other situations, people who just feel violent toward these mentally ill people, clearly that's not right. Clearly that's not right. But Kat is on point that the outrage would likely be less because they are viewed as debaucherous. And in fact, there is a lot of debauchery that comes with their mental illness. It's unfortunate, but it's true. The solution to that is not for us to pretend like these people are what they believe themselves to be. The solution to that would be to build systems that are supportive of people with these extreme mental health conditions.
These men target these Black trans women because they know they can hurt them and get away with it. Right. It's this, there's always an excuse, even if they've had an intimate relationship, even if they were fully aware that the person was trans, they know that they could hurt this person and have the community defend them. And so, you know, it's been hard for me in these times to stand up in the way that I have in the past, because I with time have started to feel just unprotected completely, you know, like just this almost innate feeling of, I just know that if we're not even talking about Breonna Taylor, we would definitely not be talking about me.
That's true. I believe that there are some men who know full well that somebody is trans, but because they are predators and because they know that they can get away with things because this individual is mentally ill, that they will prey on them. But a predator is a horrible person, period. That is not then going to segue into, okay, well, trans women are real women. That's not the leap we're going to make. We should deal with predators, especially if you're preying on somebody that has a severe mental illness. Like, that's a trash person. But we're not going to co-sign your delusion because there are trash people about. We just need to do better as a community dealing with those trash individuals, and better as a community advocating for the mentally ill in ways that are healthy, not by pandering to their delusion.
So I was going to ask, do you think that there is ever a reason to have spaces that are just for trans women and spaces that are just for cis women? And if cis women do choose to have spaces that intentionally leave trans women out, is there any excuse for that that is not rooted in transphobia?
Before they answer this question, I'm just going to give you, because they're going to be really long-winded, but essentially they're going to say that actual women should never have a space where trans women aren't allowed, but trans women can have spaces where actual women are not allowed. That's like literally the long and short of their answers. But I'll let you hear them say it in the law, because, you know, they get really long-winded because they just don't want to come out and say that, but that's literally what they say. So
I guess my question would always be, what is that space for? Because a lot of times when we talk, we have this conversation, and this is a slide that I feel like a lot of people don't see. A lot of time when we talk about, you know, creating these spaces for cis women, we're talking about, you know, having these spaces that are centered around, you know, people who are designated female at birth dealing with biological shit, you know, which I've never felt like that's a conversation that shouldn't happen, you know, that we should sort of do away with. My worldview personally leaves space for people who were designated female at birth who don't identify as women. So sometimes when I think of like those spaces where the conversation is about, you know, things that you deal with when you're a designated female at birth, I think about, well, is that a space that's also excluding people who have those experiences who don't identify as women?
Ooh,
or is it just one that excludes trans women?
Basically what Kat is saying is, for example, if you have women who don't want to be women, but they still do things like get periods, do they get to come into these spaces for women? I mean, I guess so. If you're a woman and you want to come into a woman's only space, obviously that's inclusive of you. I think, you know, most spaces that are just for women, if a gay woman comes there, nobody kind of hoes and hums, even if they don't approve of gayness. Like, if you have a vagina, you're bleeding out of it, you got some eggs going on, you have some breasts. If you're a woman, then obviously you're included in these spaces. They're not exclusionary. Now, an exception to that would be if the space is very particular. So if the space is for heterosexual women, well, then there wouldn't really be a reason for somebody who's not heterosexual to be present there, right? The conversations are not applicable to you. But I think Kat does bring up a good point. Like, are those spaces inclusive of all women? The reality is, you can't compare trans women to actual women. A woman who's going through whatever she's going through, right? Thinks she's gay, thinks she's non-binary. At the end of the day, it's still a woman, right? So a woman's space would be for her. It would be for her because she's a woman, right? Whereas trans people, like men who think that they are women, are not women. So then a woman's space would not be for you because you're literally a man. Like, all the makeup and surgery is not going to change the fact that you're a man. So then a woman's space, a woman's only space would not be for you. And there's always women like Kim who will make an exception and say, well, if you look like a woman, you know, if you look like a duck and quack like a duck, you're a duck, right? Doesn't matter. If you say you're a duck, then you can be in the space. If you say you're a woman, you look like a woman, and you act like a woman, you're welcome here. There's always going to be women that do that. But for women who don't have that ideology, I think they should just be accepting of the fact that, like, you're not actually a woman, so you can't demand access into female spaces.
I also want to just put it out there that I've always been a person who doesn't believe in fighting to be included if I'm not included, you know, like, and that's just me. You know, I think that we should fight for inclusion for everybody else, but I'm not. If someone says they don't want me there, I'm like, oh, cool. You know, that's how I personally feel. But that doesn't mean I stop fighting for everyone else to be included. I just have never believed in groveling for, you know, inclusion personally. But that's my own take on my own way of looking at the world. But yeah, that's my position.
I feel I kind of feel the same way. Like, I'm not about to fight y'all to be in the room with you, but I do understand the implications, right? And I do also think about younger folks, and the spaces that we're creating, the containers we're creating for them, and like what they're being able to, what they're seeing and like absorbing, right?
They're literally on a channel talking about why trans people should be included in women's spaces while saying they don't care if they're not included. If you don't care if you're not included, kick rocks and leave it for the people who care. They say they're doing it for the younger generations of trans people, but you guys don't reproduce. I mean, maybe if you freeze your sperm and can get a woman to carry your child, you could reproduce, but like on the whole, they're not reproducing, right? So it's just a little disingenuous, but whatever. At the end of the day, if women don't want to accept men who believe they're women in women's spaces, it just is what it is. And it's interesting how misogynistic it is for a man to say, I want to be a woman, let me in. So misogynistic. It's like, okay, so we can't even just be women? Like, now that you've decided you're a woman too, we just have to let the men in because you get to tell us who isn't a woman? You get to decide I as a man am a woman, and now you cannot exclude me?
It's embarrassing to me, though, that folks create spaces to, what am I trying to say? I feel like white supremacy is very insidious and it's pervasive, right? And we all play a role in perpetuating white supremacist violence in any way. And I feel like, especially when we're talking about gender, I do feel that, you know, cis folks have normalized and been oppressive to gender variant people.
This is so manipulative. How is women not wanting men who think they're women in their spaces perpetuating white supremacy? It's just manipulative. It's like everybody can agree white supremacy is wrong. So if I just say that if you don't want to do what I want you to do, it's white supremacist in nature, then you'll do it. It's manipulative. And this gross manipulation, I don't like that.
And nuanced many ways. And so I understand the importance of trans folks, of GNC folks, et cetera, to have those spaces to process that trauma if they need to be able to process like how we can safely take up space in a world that does not wish to see us, that wishes to see us dead. I understand that. When it comes to cis women's spaces excluding trans women, the issue for me and what's embarrassing is that we're focusing more about the intimate forms of violence that we experience and not the actual systems and institutions perpetuating that violence and harm, and not trying to develop full solutions to dismantling that. It's very important, right, to talk about to contain like what are the specific forms of violence we're having, to discuss that with one another and to hold one another. I understand that, but to actively force other women out of a conversation or GNC folks out of a conversation means that you're actually not interested in dismantling that violence. You're actually just interested in owning and honing and naming that violence as your own.
So according to LeRae, he's saying, okay, women, you can't keep us men who want to be women out of your spaces, but we can have all the spaces we need because we need the ability to process what's going on with us. Isn't this the same thing Kim was talking about earlier about men being self-centered? It's funny how even after the men put on the dresses and say that they're women, they still engage in the same self-centered behavior. But because they present very female-like, all of a sudden, it's totally okay, and we just can't see that the same behavior you claim they have when they're being masculine is the same behavior they're exhibiting when they are being feminine. Trans people can have their own spaces because they need to be able to opine about their unique situation. But if women choose to have their own spaces to opine, we're not really interested in dismantling the system because we won't let trans people in. So trans-only spaces, good. Regular women's spaces, bad. Interesting.
Which is really embarrassing to me. And I think if we want to develop full solutions to ending the violence, then you need to figure out all the nuanced ways that gender-based violence happens and is pervasive with people who are not, or who are seen as the bottom of the rung when it comes to patriarchal violence, to figure out how we can then subvert that and create a world where we can all live with our full dignity together.
I definitely think that male-on-male violence is bad, but female spaces don't normally address male-on-male violence. They address male-on-female violence. Trans people, such as Kat and LeRae, are men who are dressing and acting like women. So their violence really falls under male-on-male violence, right? So the best place to discuss that would be with other men, you know, talking about how men choose to treat men that are feminine. It'd be like gay men wanting to come into all female space to talk about the violence against gay men. Okay, so men do enact violence on gay men, but that's male-on-male in nature. And I guess because they're mentally ill, they don't recognize that they are men. And no matter how much you look like a woman, you're a man. And so the violence against you is gendered, as in the same gender enacting violence on each other. And that's very different. And also the violence is different because a lot of the violence against trans people is because they are men who aren't choosing to present as men. Women aren't being attacked because we aren't really women. We're being attacked because we are women, right? Which is different than a man being attacked for pretending to be a woman. Like the motivations are different. But don't let me be the voice of reason.
So conversations that are had excluding people are conversations for me that they're embarrassing. Like those rooms are embarrassing because you're not actually interested in the liberation of Black people.
This idea that you're not interested in the liberation of Black people if you ever try to have an exclusionary conversation is ridiculous. Like women can talk about women's issues, men can talk about men's issues. You know, people, you know, we can have conversations that are based around the issues of children. And then we can have a time where we have issues that are all inclusive, or conversations that are all inclusive. But simply holding a conversation in a space for a particular group doesn't mean Black liberation will never happen. As long as eventually we all come together and talk about it. And like I said, violence against mentally ill people such as trans people is not right, and I'm willing to have that conversation. I just don't think if I'm talking about violence against women that I have to then discuss what men who are mentally ill and wanting to be women are going through. That may not be the appropriate place. And maybe trans people should just accept that and not be double-edged with, we can have our own spaces as trans people, but goodness forbid that you don't allow us men who think we're women to impose upon your all-female spaces. Because we're telling you that we're no longer men. And how dare you women not accept that? Sorry.
Mm-hmm. So, Lorraine, I already know that people are going to say, she said that trans women can have their own spaces, but it's wrong for cis women to have our own spaces. What's the difference? Now, I understand, but what do you think is the difference between trans folks being able to have safe space to talk about the unique harms that you experience and cis women doing the same?
Mm-hmm. I hate comparing, like, I guess it's the easiest way to compare it. Like, it's like when you have white folks and black folks, right?
No, Lorraine, he doesn't hate to compare it. He's been comparing heterosexual black people, heterosexual black women to white supremacists this whole entire video. So to say that I hate to do it, no, you don't hate to do it. You've been steadily doing it this whole time. You've been steadily doing it this whole time. But go ahead and try to explain why black women aren't allowed spaces to themselves, but black men who want to be women can both invade black female spaces and have unique spaces to themselves. I would love to see this explained.
It makes sense. It does not. We think about affirmative action, for example. And like, what does equity look like in a world that is set up to systemically force to subjugate you, right? And you have no access to the same, you don't have access to the same opportunities as the superior majority population. And so we are setting up systems that allow us to subvert that, right? And allow those to afford those opportunities to marginalized communities. When we have conversations about gender, trans folks, GNC folks, all of these gender variant folks are the marginalized community when we talk about stratification of power and violence that we experience under the gender system.
Okay, so it's the oppression Olympics. As men who want to be women, we are oppressed more than you, so then we need our own spaces. Okay, but I could argue that most issues that women face are not issues that you as a man who dresses or acts like a woman will face. When we talk about child support, when we talk about abortion, when we talk about, getting stuck with kids and being single mothers, from men, right? When we talk about our periods, when we talk about, because we want to act like being a woman is simply based on what you look like. And it's not. It's not just about, oh, I have boobs. Oh, I'm wearing makeup. Oh, I have a cute hairstyle. Oh, my voice is high pitched. That is not, that's not what makes somebody a woman. So it's weird when a man is like, okay, well, I'll get the hair, I'll get the makeup, I'll get the facial feminization surgeries, I'll get the breasts, I'll get silicone balls to look like breasts. I'm going to put on the dress. I'm going to do all these things. Okay, now I'm a woman. I can be a part of all your conversations. There's nothing you can talk about that would not involve me. It's like if only physical appearance was the only thing that mattered when it came to being a woman. If only that was it. If only it was that simple. But it's not that simple. It's not that simple at all.
To have folks who who oppress, to have the majority of folks, right, create spaces that actively suppress and isolate the folks who are already marginalized, already subjugated, already experience violence, that is just perpetuating the same system of violence. And so it's not acceptable, period. And so it's important, right? I think it's important that we are able to have open conversations about the violence that we all experience. And when we talk about intersectionality, we can talk about how, being a Black woman is a unique experience, but we can also talk about how being a Black woman, you uniquely are complicit in violence that affects other people as well. And so I think that is a particular form of violence to be inflicted on trans people, is to say, hey, we need cis women's spaces. We don't want these folks in this room because y'all are not women.
It's violent to exclude trans people. Maybe it's violent for men who believe that they are women to impose themselves on women. Maybe as a man who believes he is a woman, it is doubling down on patriarchy, negative patriarchy, and misogyny for you to then say that women are enacting violence against men who want to be women. This is like a rabbit hole. So men get to both have their maleness and take our femaleness. So if you are a man and you put on a dress, all of a sudden now we don't reserve the right to separate ourselves from that? We're being violent? This is not more misogyny and male violence against women? For men to want to come in and enter a female space because they've now decided that they are women too? So now you have no safe space as women? Because all it takes is a man wanting to be a woman for your space to no longer be able to be female only? That's interesting. It's interesting. So men just have all the choices. Women have no choices, is what he's saying. Is women have no options. The only options you have are the options that men give you. You can't even have a space to have a conversation about being a woman because I, as a man, have decided that I'm a woman too. So now let me in. Or you're being violent toward me. Imagine women being told they're being violent toward men who want to be women by not allowing them access to all female spaces. It's insane.
And then then it's murky, because then what defines womanhood? What defines, like, why do you think that you can own womanhood and you can own this identity and others cannot?
By others, he means men. Why do women think they can own womanhood and men who want to be women cannot own womanhood? It's crazy to me that Harriet is a feminist and she's co-signing this. Co-signing a man coming in and saying, what right do women have to decide and to own womanhood? Well, we're women. Doesn't the ownership come with the being a woman? So now men can come in and tell us, oh, you don't get to own womanhood. I've decided I'm a woman too. I'm gonna just play in this party too. What right do you have to tell me as a man I can't be a woman too? Come again?